The Butcher of Plainfield, a true crime, a quiet town with dark secrets. Plainfield, Wisconsin, a place so ordinary it almost feels invisible. A small farming community, tucked away in the American Midwest, where life once seemed simple, safe, predictable. Neighbors waved at each other from their porches. Families gathered for church on Sundays. Gossip circulated about little things, the weather, the price of crops, who was courting who. On the surface, it was the very image of small-town America. But under that surface, a darkness festered. Because in Plainfield, one man would blur the line between nightmare and reality. His crimes would shock the nation, redefine horror, and inspire stories so grotesque that decades later, they would still echo through books, films, and nightmares. That man was Edward Theodore Gein. This is not just the story of a killer. It's the story of how a boy, raised under the crushing weight of isolation, religious fanaticism, and abuse, could grow into something far more terrifying than anyone around him dared to imagine. As we walk through this tale, room by room, memory by memory, prepare yourself. Because to understand Ed Gein, you have to step into his world. One built on silence, shadows, and unspeakable secrets. And before we begin, let me remind you, if you find yourself captivated by true crime stories, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and click the notification bell. That way, you won't miss the next case we dive into. The roots of a monster. The roots of Ed Gein's story lie in a household unlike most others in Plainfield. His mother, Augusta, was a force of nature. Thick-set, stern-faced, and uncompromising, she was the iron fist that ruled the Gein family. Augusta was a woman raised under the shadow of strict religion and the lash of her father's discipline. To her, the world was divided cleanly, righteous or sinful, holy or damned, and her word in the household was law. George, her husband, was the opposite. Where Augusta was loud and controlling, George was quiet, broken, and weak. He had grown up an orphan, having lost his family in a Mississippi River tragedy. He drifted through life, bouncing between jobs, railroad worker, carpenter, insurance salesman, but never keeping steady work. He had one constant companion, though, alcohol. George drank away his paychecks and numbed his failures in the taverns of Wisconsin. And when he stumbled home drunk, he found courage in his fists. He would lash out at Augusta, striking her. But Augusta was never the type to cower. She prayed aloud for God to strike her husband dead, condemning him as a worthless, lazy sinner in front of their children. Somehow, this broken pair produced two boys, Henry, born in 1902, and Edward, born 4 years later in 1906. From the start, Augusta made sure her sons were kept far from what she considered the filth of the world. She pulled them out of town life in La Crosse, moving the family to an isolated farm in Plainfield in 1915. 155 acres of lonely fields and woods, miles from neighbors, miles from temptation. For Augusta, isolation wasn't a burden, it was protection. She believed all women, except herself, were vile, sinful creatures, temptresses who led men into ruin. To her, every woman was a harlot, an agent of the devil. She made sure Henry and Ed grew up believing it too. At school, Edward stood out. He was shy, quiet, with peculiar mannerisms. Sometimes he would burst into laughter for no reason, later explaining he was laughing at private jokes in his head. Teachers and classmates whispered about how odd he seemed. Friendships were rare, and if Ed ever tried to make one, Augusta shut it down. Friends, she insisted, would only corrupt him. So Ed grew up under the crushing shadow of his mother. To him, Augusta was not only a parent, but a best friend, a guide, and, perhaps in ways we can only shudder to imagine, an object of obsession. Death in the family. By 1940, Ed was in his 30s, but he still lived at home. His father, George, finally succumbed to years of alcohol abuse and died of heart failure. The death of George barely shook the family. If anything, Augusta saw it as God's judgment. But for Ed and Henry, it meant they had to step up to keep the farm running. They picked up odd jobs around town, shoveling snow, doing handyman work, helping neighbors with chores. Ed was considered reliable, if strange. said he was polite, even gentle, but there was something off. Henry, however, was moving on with his life. He began a relationship with a divorced mother of two and made plans for a future with her. And Henry worried about Ed. His younger brother seemed frozen, unable to live beyond the orbit of Augusta. Ed clung to their mother like a lifeline, unable or unwilling to separate himself. Henry even began criticizing Augusta openly in front of Ed. He called her overbearing, controlling, even abusive. To Ed, those words weren't just offensive, they were blasphemy. Augusta wasn't just his mother. She was the pillar of his existence. In May of 1944, the brothers were working on the farm, burning brush. A fire got out of control, and when it was finally put out, Ed reported Henry missing. A search party found Henry's body face down, unburned, but with strange bruises on his head. The official cause of death? Asphyxiation. The bruises? Ignored. The police chalked it up to the chaos of the fire, but suspicion lingered. Had Ed killed his own brother to protect his mother's honor? No one could prove it, but some would later wonder if Henry's death was the first sign of something far darker. Mother and son. With Henry gone, Ed was left alone with Augusta, and in his eyes, that was exactly how it should be. He doted on her. He obeyed her every word. He absorbed her sermons about sin, lust, and the wickedness of women. But even as he worshipped her, Augusta never spared him from her cruelty. She berated him, called him weak, told him he would never survive without her. In December 1945, Augusta had a stroke and died. For Ed, the loss was catastrophic. He was 39 years old, with no wife, no children, no close friends, and now no mother. The one person who defined his entire world was gone. He was devastated, broken, untethered. But in his grief, something else took root. His obsession with his mother didn't die with her. It grew. Ed sealed off Augusta's bedroom, keeping it pristine, as though she still lived there. The rest of the farmhouse, however, descended into filth. Trash piled high. Dust thickened. The house became a nest of decay, except for Augusta's sacred room. Ed became a hoarder, collecting odd items, newspapers, junk. He drifted further into isolation, rarely venturing beyond the farm except for odd jobs or a beer at Mary Hogan's tavern. To the townsfolk, Ed was odd but harmless, a little eccentric, a little lonely. Nobody guessed that behind his pale face and quiet manner, something unspeakable was taking shape, the secret world of Ed Gein. After Augusta's death, Ed's loneliness deepened into obsession. He began reading obsessively, books on anatomy, adventure stories about cannibals, and magazines about the atrocities of Nazi Germany. He became fascinated by the idea of death, by corpses, by what lay beneath the skin. And then, one night, he took the next step. Ed began visiting local cemeteries. He claimed later that he fell into what he called dazed states, wandering at night, compelled by some force he couldn't explain. He would dig up recently buried women, bodies that reminded him of his mother. He would take them back to the farmhouse. There, in the dark, Ed began to experiment. He tanned human skin, carved bones, and assembled grotesque keepsakes. He made masks out of faces, bowls out of skulls, lampshades out of flesh. He even tried to fashion a woman's suit, a suit of skin he could wear, piece by piece, in some macabre attempt to become his mother again. The quiet handyman, the odd farm boy everyone thought was harmless, had created a house of horrors. And yet, for years, no one knew. If you're still with me in this chilling journey, don't forget, subscribe, hit that like button, and ring the notification bell. It helps us keep bringing you these deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime. The tavern keeper, Mary Hogan. The first name in the chain of disappearances tied directly to Ed Gein was Mary Hogan. Mary wasn't like the other women in Plainfield. She was bold, brash, and unapologetically loud. She ran a local tavern, a smoky room where farmers gathered after long days in the fields, where laughter and arguments spilled into the night. To many, Mary was magnetic, but to Augusta Gein, she was the embodiment of everything sinful. A divorced woman, outspoken, unashamed unashamed of her independence. Mary was exactly the kind of fallen woman Augusta had spent decades warning Ed about. But by the late 1940s, Augusta was gone, and Ed, lonely, adrift, still clinging to his mother's memory, began frequenting Mary's tavern. The regulars thought it odd. Ed, the quiet farmhand who hardly spoke above a murmur, sitting at the bar and staring at Mary with glassy eyes. He would laugh nervously at her jokes, hang on her words. To him, Mary was more than a woman. She was a shadow of Augusta's warnings and, at the same time, a forbidden fascination. On a cold December evening in 1954, Mary Hogan disappeared. Blood was found on the floor of her tavern, a trail leading out to the snow. But Mary herself was gone. At the time, police investigated but came up empty. Rumors swirled. Maybe she had run away. Maybe someone had killed her and dumped her body in the woods. What nobody suspected was that Mary Hogan was already resting in Ed Gein's farmhouse. Months later, townsfolk would recall chilling moments. Ed, in his awkward way, would joke about Mary. "She's not missing," he'd say. "She's at the farm now." People laughed it off. Ed was odd, sure, but dangerous? Nobody believed it. But in the shadow of his farmhouse walls, Ed's obsession with Mary Hogan took a horrifying form. The disappearance of Mary Hogan. Mary's vanishing act was only the beginning. For Plainfield, life went on. The police had no suspects. The community whispered but eventually let the story fade into the background. But inside Ed's farmhouse, the silence deepened, filled only by the sound of his grotesque work. Ed's obsession with women like Mary, their strength, their independence, their vitality, grew darker. He didn't just want to possess them, he wanted to become them. By this point, Ed was making frequent trips to local cemeteries under the cover of night. In his confessions later, he claimed he dug up as many as 40 graves, though he swore he only took bodies home from about 9. Recently buried women, chosen because they reminded him of Augusta. Once in his farmhouse, Ed stripped away what he wanted, the skin, the bones, the hair. He stitched pieces together, shaping grotesque masks and trophies. He wore the masks, sometimes even full-body suits, parading through the house as if he were someone else entirely, as if, for fleeting moments, he could bring Augusta back by stepping into her skin. To the outside world, Ed remained the helpful odd-job man. He babysat local kids, fixed fences, shoveled snow. People found him eccentric but harmless. Nobody could imagine what he was doing in the stillness of his farmhouse. But all of that was about to change, because in November of 1957, Ed Gein would make a mistake. A mistake that would tear down the walls of secrecy and expose the horrors hidden in Plainfield. Quick pause. If this chilling story has pulled you in, remember to subscribe, like, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next case. Now, let's step into the turning point of the Ed Gein story. Bernice Worden's vanishing. It was November 16, 1957, deer hunting season in Wisconsin. Most of the men in Plainfield were out in the woods, rifles in hand. The town was quieter than usual. That morning, Ed walked into Worden's hardware store, run by Bernice Worden's, a well-liked and respected woman in her 50s. Bernice was known for her kindness, her sharp business sense, and her strong presence in the community. Ed asked about antifreeze. Later that day, Bernice's son, Frank Worden's, returned from hunting to find the store empty. The cash register drawer was open, money missing, and on the floor drops of blood. Frank immediately suspected foul play, and he had someone in mind, because Ed Gein had been hanging around the store the past few days, asking odd questions, making strange remarks. And just that morning, Frank remembered Ed had been the last person seen with his mother. Police searched the Worden store and found a sales slip for antifreeze. The name written down? Gein. By evening, police officers were knocking on the door of the Gein farmhouse. Ed wasn't home, but when they peered through the windows, their flashlights caught something that made their blood run cold. Inside, the farmhouse was a nightmare. The house of horrors. Inside the Gein farmhouse. Plainfield police entered Ed Gein's home, expecting to find clues about Bernice Warden's disappearance. What they found instead was a descent into madness. The farmhouse was pitch dark, filthy, and freezing. The stench was overwhelming, rotting flesh, dust, and decay. Trash covered the floors. Newspapers were stacked to the ceiling. But what stopped the officers in their tracks wasn't the filth. It was Bernice Warden's. Her body was discovered in a shed, hanging upside down by her ankles. She had been gutted like a deer, her torso split open, her head missing. But that was only the beginning. Room by room, the farmhouse revealed horrors beyond comprehension. In the kitchen, bowls made from human skulls. In the living room, lampshades stitched from human skin. Masks made from faces, complete with lips and eyelashes. A box of noses, belts crafted from nipples, chairs upholstered in human hide. And in a paper bag, Mary Hogan's face, peeled off and preserved like a grotesque trophy. The officers stood frozen, their flashlights trembling. This was no ordinary crime scene. This was a museum of the macabre. The discovery sent shockwaves through Plainfield and beyond. The handyman, the quiet oddball everyone thought was harmless, had been living among the dead. The farmhouse wasn't just Ed Gein's home. It was a tomb, a workshop, a nightmare made real. This is heavy stuff, I know, but if you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe and like. It helps us keep telling these stories, no matter how dark they get. Now let's step deeper into the mind of Ed Gein himself. Ed's confessions, inside the mind of a killer. After his arrest, Ed Gein was brought into custody, and what followed stunned investigators. First, Ed was quiet, soft-spoken, timid, almost apologetic. He didn't fight, didn't shout, didn't even deny what had been found in his farmhouse. He simply talked, and as the words poured out, the picture of his crimes grew darker with every passing hour. Ed admitted to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden's, though he claimed both deaths had been accidental. But his confessions didn't stop there. He described, in shocking detail, how he spent years sneaking into cemeteries at night, digging up recently buried women. He said he would fall into a trance, not even remembering the digging until he stood at the foot of an open grave. He wasn't searching for valuables. He wasn't even looking for companionship. Ed admitted he wanted to bring them home, to peel away what he needed, to build what he later called his woman suit. Investigators pressed him. Why would he desecrate graves? Why would he craft these grotesque objects? Ed's answer was chilling. He said he wanted to crawl inside the skin of a woman, to become his mother, to feel like Augusta again, if only for a moment. Doctors would later call this a grotesque mix of necrophilia, psychosis, and identity disorder. To Ed, it was simply his way of coping, a way of keeping Augusta alive. But it wasn't coping, it was horror. Every word Ed spoke painted him less as a diabolical mastermind and more as a broken man, driven by obsession, trapped in a twisted devotion to the woman who had raised and destroyed him in equal measure. Yet even in confession, Ed remained disturbingly calm. He didn't seem to grasp the gravity of his actions. To him, it was all just normal. The trial of Ed Gein, insanity or evil. The case of Ed Gein rocked Wisconsin and soon the entire country. The Butcher of Plainfield, as headlines called him, became the center of one of the most bizarre trials in American history. The court faced a chilling question. Was Ed Gein legally insane? Or was he a calculating killer who understood what he was doing? The prosecution argued that Ed was fully aware of his actions. After all, he planned his grave robberies carefully, avoided detection for years, and even admitted to using disguises to sneak into cemeteries. His crimes, they said, required cunning and intent. The defense, however, leaned heavily on Ed's confessions of hallucinations, trances, and his obsession with Augusta. They painted a picture of a man completely detached from reality, unable to distinguish right from wrong. Psychiatrists testified that Ed suffered from schizophrenia and psychotic delusions. He wasn't just eccentric, he was severely disturbed. The jury listened, horrified, as evidence was presented. The skin masks, the furniture, the human remains cataloged piece by piece. For many in the courtroom, it was too much to bear. In the end, the court ruled that Ed Gein was legally insane. He was found guilty of murder, but immediately committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, rather than sent to prison. It was a decision that outraged some and relieved others. To many, it felt like justice had been sidestepped. But to psychiatrists, it was the only logical outcome. Ed would spend the rest of his life behind hospital walls, watched, studied, and contained. If you're still here with me, you're exactly the kind of person who digs deep into the darkest corners of true crime. Don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and tap the notification bell, because there are more stories like this waiting. Now, let's follow Ed into the long twilight of his life. Life inside the asylum. For the next 3 decades, Ed Gein lived not as a prisoner, but as a patient. At Central State Hospital and later at Mendota Mental Health Institute, Ed became ordinary. The horrors of his farmhouse seemed to vanish inside the sterile white walls. Nurses described him as quiet, polite, even helpful. He enjoyed reading pulp magazines and old adventure stories. He did chores. He rarely caused trouble. It was as if the Ed Gein who crafted masks from human faces had been locked away, replaced by a frail, mumbling man who shuffled through the halls like a ghost. But was it an act? Or was this his true nature? A broken child who only became a monster in the isolation of his farm? Doctors studied him, but Ed never fully explained his crimes. He spoke of them in passing, never with the weight or horror others attached to them. In some ways, he never seemed to understand why the world called him a monster. To him, he was just Ed. Years turned into decades. As the world outside changed, as movies and books began to borrow from his story, Ed aged quietly inside the hospital. His hair went white, his health failed, and by the 1980s, he was frail and forgotten. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure at the age of 77. The man who inspired nightmares, who lived among death, was gone. But his legacy, his shadow, was just beginning. The legacy of horror. Even before his death, Ed Gein's story had escaped Plainfield and spread across the globe. Hollywood was quick to pounce. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho, the story of Norman Bates, a timid motel owner obsessed with his dead mother. The resemblance was unmistakable. A decade later, Ed's grisly trophies inspired Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a killer who wore masks made of human skin. And then came The Silence of the Lambs with Buffalo Bill, the murderer who skinned his victims to create a woman's suit. Ed Gein never left his farmhouse, but through film, literature, and legend, his darkness spread worldwide. He became the archetype of the modern boogeyman, the quiet neighbor who hides unthinkable horrors behind closed doors. But beyond the movies, Ed's story is a mirror reflecting our deepest fears: isolation, obsession, and the human mind's capacity to warp under pressure. Plainfield never forgot. The Gein farm was eventually burned down by locals, erasing the nightmare house from the landscape. But the scars remained. For those who lived through it, Ed wasn't just a horror story. He was their neighbor, their handyman, their babysitter, and that, perhaps, is the most chilling part of all: the butcher's shadow. And so, the story of Ed Gein comes to an end. A lonely farm boy, shaped by the iron grip of an overbearing mother, growing into a man who blurred the line between life and death, sanity and madness. A man whose crimes were so grotesque they shocked an entire nation, and whose legacy still seeps into our nightmares through the stories we tell. But beyond the shock, there are questions worth asking. How much of Ed's monstrosity was born in his farmhouse? And how much was born in Augusta's shadow? Could anyone have stopped him? Or was he always destined to walk this path? And perhaps most unsettling, how many other Ed Geins might live hidden among us, waiting to be discovered? If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, thank you. True crime isn't just about gore or shock. It's about understanding the darkness so we can better recognize the light. So let me leave you with this: Ed Gein wasn't a movie villain. He was real. He lived. He breathed. He walked among his neighbors, fixing their fences and babysitting their children. And behind his door lay horrors they couldn't even imagine. That's why stories like this matter. To remind us that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, it smiles politely and shakes your hand. If the story gripped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. It helps us keep uncovering the darkest cases in history, and it makes sure you never miss the next one. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, monsters are real, and sometimes they live next door.